Hello and welcome to the GTHL team preview show. Thomas West alongside Liam Crothers. Today we'll be looking at the Vaughan Kings, a team with a bunch of OHL or potential OHL draft talent.
Yeah, I mean, top to bottom, this forward core is stacked, and there's not really one player that you can look at and didn't say they contributed in some way to the 2019-20 season. It's going to be a fun breakdown. We'll get into some of the stories and some of the names as we move through this show.
Okay, well, let's look at some of those names right now. We'll start with the lines first for the Vaughan Kings. The forwards were very strong. They had strong defenders, but right up the middle, you can't deny those centers.
Yeah, and I mean, every single one of the names that you see in the middle of this screen has OHL draft potential. The first guy on that list, Giacomo MARTINO, number 22. It's not next to him just because of the number of goals he scored in the 2019-20 season. He's a tremendous player in terms of getting the puck towards the net. Anselmo REGO's got a ton of talent, and Stefan FORGIONE is a big physical player as well.
So this was a team that did have a lot of talent this year, and we had a good time watching this team. Who exactly stands out for you in these lines, or who are some of the picks that you think are important to watch in the upcoming OHL draft?
There's a collection of players. I think the Vaughan Kings, the way that they structured their forward core was one of the best that we saw in the GTHL. And, you know, I would say that the defensive lines do take a bit of a back seat to that, but that's not to discredit the talent on the back end. It's more to emphasize how good that forward group was. There's a lot of guys that we saw in that group that are going to have that first round, second round, third round potential. It's just a question of where we end up seeing those guys go.
Well, let's take a look at an overall look at the GTHL right now. We'll start with the standings. As you can see, obviously the Toronto Junior Canadiens did take the top spot, but the Vaughan Kings were a strong team this year, heading in at 4th place in the GTHL and right up there with that top group with the 3 Toronto teams there. We'll transition over to another standings board we have as well, and this is from myhockey.com, and things are a little bit different here. Take us through this.
So this is a little bit more unconventional than what you had just talked about. What we were looking at for the Vaughan Kings on the last screen was the regular season standings, how they matched up against all the teams in the GTHL. This is a little bit different. You're going to see a couple different numbers on your screen. The rating number, the average goal differential, and the strength of schedule. Those are all important. You see the Vaughan Kings sitting in 7th. The one thing that I want to look at here is the average goal differential, just a little bit under 1, and maybe that explains their position at the end of the season.
Yeah, and you can say one thing that was really strong for this team as well. We mentioned the forwards. How important was it in terms of a strength for this team to have 3 lines in the forwards that they could roll through whenever they want?
Well, it was interesting to see the Vaughan Kings, the way that they approach the offense, because they like to cycle the puck around. And, I mean, you look at some of the talent that I had already named. I mean, I mentioned some goal scorers. I mentioned some high-skill individually, guys who are high-skilled individually. But, I mean, the real strength comes from those players that can work the puck in along the boards. We'll get to some of them in a bit. But, I mean, just the way that they worked their offense was tremendously efficient. They were able to recycle play quite a bit.
Okay, well, now we have a few projections coming up. Who our players are going to be that we're looking at for and where they're going to go in the OHL draft. We'll start with yours.
I mean, I've got those 3 centers in rounds 2 to 3. That's not to discredit their talent. I would just say that there's such a saturation of round 1 talent throughout this draft. It might come down to what a team needs. I mean, I like all 3 of those centers that I've slotted in rounds 2 to 3. We get to 4 to 7. This is where things get interesting. We've got Luciano SUPINO. We've got Cole BARRETT, Denver Geyer, Andrew WYCISK, and Mason Vicari here as well. I mean, I like all of these players. They all offer something different. Vicari was tremendous, and you get a little bit later into those rounds as well. There are a couple guys in those spots that I think are going to be solid pickups for whatever OHL team decides to pick them up.
And you have those 3 centers sitting there in the second round. Obviously, Giacomo Martino, he's not the biggest guy, but some people see him as a bit of an underrated player on this team, even though he did score 22 goals this year. Why do you have him in the second round? Is he more of an upper second round pick for you?
I think so, and when I say second round pick, I do mean the first pick in the second round. He's almost comparable to a John Tavares style because, and I've said that before, it looks like he's having a quiet night, and then you look at the stat sheet and you realize he's got a goal and an assist. Where did those come from? He's a quiet player. He's got a lot of talent. Whoever picks this guy up is going to be very, very happy with him.
Okay, well, I have made my own as well projection, and this does differ a little bit from yours. I am totally with you with having Giacomo Martino there, except I do have him as a late first-round pick. I think he does have a ton of talent. Another guy that I have up as well is SUPINO. This is a guy who he has the ability to score, but he has the ability to put a lot of physical play on the other team, and I think that is something that's going to translate very well at the OHL level. Barrett, Geyer, Lanny, and FEHR, those are all guys that could easily be going in the 4th to 7th round for me. We had a very similar discussion on that. STRIZZI, KALLO, MCISAAC, and KALLO are in rounds 8 to 12, and Stevens and Mayo as well, looking to get into the OHL draft in rounds 13 to 15. We talk about Supino. That was something that was a little bit different in our boards. Why do you have him where you had him, and what do you think that the difference was there for us?
I think what it comes down to is you put the emphasis on that physical style of play that he implements, and I think that's great. I think any OHL team can use that, but I think it's a bit more of a question of how much individual skill does he have in creating his own plays. We know how good of a facilitator he is. We know how good he is along the boards. We know how good he is physically. I think some team is going to overlook his individual talent, because me saying that isn't to discredit his ability. It's just that I don't think with the exposure that these kids have had this year that the first thing you notice about Supino is his talent, is his hands.
Okay, let's transition over to the last line of defense. We've talked about the forwards, we've talked about the defense. These are some guys who don't necessarily go in the top rounds all the time, the goalies. But the Vaughan Kings do have a very strong goalie who has some potential to be one of the first goalies picked.
And you look at where he started the season, you look at where he finished it. Mason Vicari is projected to be one of the first goalies taken in this upcoming OHL draft. He had a fantastic performance in the back half of the season, and then going into the playoffs, he faced some goaltending opposition that we'll talk about when we get to the Toronto Junior Canadiens. But, I mean, Mason Vicari played phenomenally, made a ton of huge saves.
Yeah, and he played the majority of the games for his team, and especially I think some of his best performances when it mattered the most in the playoffs. What can you speak to how well he played in the playoffs, especially in that series against the Junior Canadiens where they were in tough?
Well, I think the clutch gene is something that broadcasters like us like to bring up sometimes to describe how a guy plays in those high-pressure situations. Mason Vicari has that, and I think any OHL team that takes this guy is going to be very happy with how he plays in the Memorial Cup playoffs.
Okay, let's move over to some sleeper picks now. These are some guys who may not be taken in the 1st or 2nd round, or maybe even 4th, 5th, or 6th rounds, but they're teams that they're guys that people should look out for. We'll start with yours.
And I had mentioned the physical style that the Vaughan Kings play along the boards. That comes from a guy like Cole BARRETT. He's got a fantastic forechecking game. He can facilitate. He can recycle possession. He works very effectively in those dirty areas, throwing the body occasionally, separating players from the puck with either his momentum or his stick. And I mean, he's so disciplined, and I think that's important for a player that plays the physical style. You can see only 14 penalty minutes in 31 regular season games, not a single penalty minute in those playoffs for the Vaughan Kings.
Yeah, and it would be great to see a team take a guy like that in, the mid rounds, as he could really provide some value for a team. Okay, we're going to switch over now to my sleeper pick. And as you can see right here, I have Marco COLELLA. Now, this I don't believe is a guy he's going to be going in the later rounds, I believe, in the draft. But COLELLA is an interesting guy. He played at AA the year before the 2019-20 season, which we have been referencing here. And he really improved during this season. This was a guy who went from being not a particularly top player on the team to a guy who played some very important minutes for the Vaughan Kings. And if this kind of progression keeps going for a guy like Marco COLELLA, he is going to be certainly a very valuable player down the stretch for an OHL team if he is to get drafted. Now, we have some other players as well that there's some movement between these teams. So let's talk first about the players that are moving away from the Vaughan Kings. Some interesting names to look at, and a lot of names to look at on this team. Some cornerstones like Anselmo REGO and Luciano SUPINO. This team is going to be missing these guys, but we'll get to the acquisitions after.
It's interesting. You see 3 defensemen here from this team move over to the Red Wings, and you saw 2 forwards there that played together. Mayo and STRIZZI have both joined the Mississauga Reps for what would have been the upcoming season. It's interesting to see that much turnover in a team that I think played very well, and their defense was almost an underrated part of how well they were able to produce in the regular season.
Now let's take a look at some of the players that they're going to add to fill those holes. And they do have some names coming in. Obviously, Alex Weiermeyer is probably the cornerstone of those acquisitions coming in. But there's also a few players that we haven't seen in the GTHL because they didn't play in the GTHL. We have the Grey Bruce Highlanders product, Quentin Page, who was there, Shea Lauren from Forest Hill Force, that's a AA team, and Caden Long as well, coming for the North Bay Trappers. A couple names to note.
Would have been interesting to see how Weiermeyer filled that hole in the forward group, and we see 3 different defensemen come in to replace the ones going out.
And Liam McKenzie, he was obviously a strong player for the Toronto Nationals as well. It'll be interesting to see how he fits into the Kings lineup. So a lot to fill, but these are the players that are coming in. We appreciate you tuning into this team preview show for the Vaughan Kings. And we have all of these games that we've mentioned before on our YouTube channel, which you can go watch the full games as the OHL draft grows closer and closer. So we appreciate you tuning in. From Thomas West and Liam Crothers. We'll see you next time.